So I left off talking about how the human ear responds to sound pressure levels, and it's a good place to introduce this idea of how we measure this sound pressure level, the dB. And we do that with meters. So on the left we have an iPhone app that measures sound pressure level, and on the right we have a technical instrument that a professional would use to do assessments of acoustics in spaces. And so these are decibels are a logarithmic function. So say going from 80 to 100 dB is not a linear, or let me use another example. Going from 50 dB to 100 dB is not a doubling of sound, but a logarithmic increase. So it's factors of, it could be as much as 10 times as loud. And so you keep that in mind that a minor change from 80 dB to 100 dB, or what might seem like that, is a very significant change in the sound pressure levels. And we have pressure levels that are painful, and I think I have a chart coming up on that. I'm going to just run through a few of the terms though right away. A Sabin is a measurement of sound absorptivity. It's really important for architects to understand this concept and how it's measured. So in this case, we have an acoustical test room. It has microphones in it and speakers to create sound. A specimen is placed in the room, and the difference between the specimen recording of the amount of sound that the microphone is receiving when there is no specimen in the room and compared to when there is a specimen gives us an indication of how much sound has been absorbed. And that is the measurement of absorptivity of the material, and that's an indication of how effective that material will be in absorbing sound if it was placed into a room. Say that material was a ceiling panel and going to be placed into a restaurant, the measurement of the Sabin, the sound reduction value, will allow us to determine if it's a better performing one over another one with a lower value. We should all be familiar with this idea of pitch, low pitch, deep sounds, long wavelengths, where human hearing runs from the threshold of human hearing runs from 20 cycles per second, 20 hertz, up to maybe 15,000 hertz, and that decreases with age. Um, so we'll come back to the requirement of understanding this idea of pitch, and then how this idea of frequencies actually appears in outputs of things that we look at. So I put this up to kind of show you. Here's a overly simplified idea of a sound wave, but it's actually more complicated than that. So all of our sounds have coloration to them, harmonics and nuances of other sounds resonating with it. So in this case, we have that same wave with another one implied upon it and are superimposed. And really, they're very much superimposed, so much in fact that an output of human speech looks something like this. So we have other terms, this idea of magnitude, the loudness of something. We have sound power level. Typically, we're talking about things that are creating the sound. Um, sound pressure levels, SPL, sound intensity level. Um, all of these terms relate to the intention of why somebody is measuring a certain value. And we've talked about this idea of using decibels. So that's going to be one of our primary assessment tools in understanding sound. But there are many times when we're actually trying to produce sound and create a sound pressure level, and we may want to measure the output in these specific ways. And then we have this idea of intensity, power per unit area, watts per centimeter squared. And I have a graphic for that. Um, and then this idea of amplitude, crescendo in music. So we have quiet passages and loud passages. And so the amplitude or volume of that can vary. So this was that graphic of the idea of sound pressure. So just like light, um, things go rapidly down the further you get away from the sound source. And It's an important consideration that one of the biggest controls we have in our creation of space to control annoyances in sound is to move the sound source away from the listener or the people that are perceiving the sound. Um, that doesn't necessarily always work, but it's something to keep in mind because it sound quickly dissipates as a squared function. Reverberation is a term that we will deal with a lot when we talk about acoustics and architecture, especially when we're trying to create rooms that are either sound lively or dead. A lively space is imagine a room without any furniture in it. You've just moved into an apartment and no carpets or windows, drapes are on the walls, and you walk across the floor and it sounds like you hear the reverberation of every motion that you make within the room. In a dead room is the approach of something that's been covered with sound absorbing materials, and there's very little reverberation of sound. And we, as architects and designers, try to do a lot to control that idea of that reverberation, the reverberation time, by creating absorption surfaces and reflective surfaces. Sometimes to benefit us, sometimes we want reflective surfaces to create liveliness, and other times we want to have these surfaces absorbing sound and or diffusing sound. So there's a whole host of architectural interventions that we can use to alter this idea of reverberation. And as I said, we have this idea of long reverberation times, uh, desirable for musical performances, live spaces, but short reverberation times are desirable for speaking performances, for this idea of a dead space, as I said before. And obviously, you don't want a really lively space for music if it starts to create um, um, a very busy type of sound. So there's always a lot of acoustical intervention to strike the right balance between those two. Attenuate. When we talk about sound and trying to change its character, whether it be its volume or its tone, we're trying to attenuate it. And then I'll pick this up in the next section. We'll start talking about this idea of sound between spaces.